Hello and welcome to all of our Periscope and Meerkat followers out there. I'm Sam Batkins, the Director of Regulatory Policy at the American Action Forum, and I'm honored to be here with Senator Lankford from Oklahoma, and this is AAF's first Periscope Meerkat. We didn't know what it was until a few weeks ago, and here we are, sitting in the U.S. Capitol doing a Periscope Meerkat with the U.S. Senator, and we're here to talk about regulation, and namely the Cut Red Tape Initiative from the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. And my first question, Senator, is basically what was the impetus for the idea behind the Cut Red Tape Initiative?
Yeah, good to see everybody. Hopefully this is helpful in the conversation. Really, the Cut Red Tape Initiative was designed to be able to find a way to get past just the Washington conversation about regulations. Everyone knows ground zero for the federal government right now and dealing with the federal government is a regulatory state. The number of regulations, the speed of those regulations, the size, frequency of their coming out, all of those things. So we're trying to find a way to get to individual families, small businesses, medium-sized businesses. They don't have a lobbyist that's coming in and complaining about regulations, and they just know there's a problem. They may know there is some particular regulation, they don't know where to put it out there. So actually it was a bipartisan conversation that happened during a hearing with the Office of Management and Budget as we were going back and forth saying, how do people complain? How do people get complaint? And we realized that there's not a way that people can really engage with the federal government and be able to do that. So we just decided we're going to create it. So we've started this process called the Cut Red Tape Initiative to identify how do we get voices from around the country to identify bad regulations, out-of-date regulations, or how to control regulators.
So the Cut Red Tape Initiative has been going now, it's my understanding, several weeks, a little bit more longer than a month, I think. Have there been any common complaints, criticisms that you've heard from American business individuals, any particularly weird complaints?
Yeah, we're really taking the complaints as they come in, and we're keeping them anonymous. So that people really know that they can submit this idea or this issue and not be afraid of the regulator that's coming after them at that point. And we're separating them off into really three buckets. One bucket is that we've got a problem with a regulator that's out of control. Another bucket is this is an issue that has to be solved in law, that we've got to actually pass something to be able to change. And then another one that the agency already has the statutory authority to make the change, and that kind of sends us our directions of which way to be able to go.
And when you served in the House previously, you were a leader on regulatory reform, and the House passed several regulatory reform bills, fundamental regulatory reform, targeted regulatory reform, and of course, a lot of that stalled in the Senate.
Yeah, it went nowhere in the Senate.
And now that is going to change, we hope. What are the prospects for regulatory reform on the Senate floor, getting out of the Senate, and sort of the likelihood of that happening?
I think we can actually make some progress on this, and I don't mean to sound overly optimistic. But the committee that I'm on, Homeland Security Governmental Affairs, we're going to start trying to pass smaller pieces of regulatory reform. The big, comprehensive, giant reform bills, we're not going to get through. They'll be so contentious, but we can take different sections and say we can do this. For instance, this morning, our committee did a hearing on a permitting regulatory reform, passed that out of committee. It actually passed out of committee on a strong bipartisan vote, and then we'll go on to the Senate floor in the days ahead. It deals with just the permitting process for things like pipeline and construction and all those things. Right now, the federal government's just holding on to permits and not releasing them. They're not saying yes or no. They're just saying we're going to think about it. The Keystone Pipeline being the biggest example of that the administration's had for over 6 years. They've not said yes or no to it. They've just said we're going to think about it. Well, that kind of process is out there all over all kinds of agencies. So we're trying to find a way to say, let's expedite the decision-making process, that if you have a request for a permit, you know what time period you're actually going to get an answer.
So there's some hope.
There is some hope. We're just going to take it a slice at a time. Anyone who looks at this government and says, gosh, they're going to pass something big is kidding themselves. But if we can take some smaller sections and say, okay, let's start moving some of these ideas and not just sit around and say we can't do anything. We can do some things. So let's do what we can at this point.
The American Action Forum's Reg Rodeo site, regrodeo.com, if you're on your computer now, which I assume you are, has basically tallied almost $800 billion in total regulatory costs since just 2007.
Right.
But people's eyes sort of glaze over when they hear big numbers, whether it's budget or regulation. How can we sort of communicate these oftentimes very hidden regulatory burdens to just the average people so they say, oh, well, that's why my dishwasher is slightly more expensive or my car is slightly more expensive?
Yeah, but that's exactly what it is. About 12% of the gross domestic product of the United States is regulations, the cost of regulations. So it's very, very expensive into everything we buy, but it's built in. You don't see it. So big, for instance, they just did a report that just came out today, actually, on the cost of new automobiles. And they talked about the increasing cost of automobiles. When you actually look at the reason for the increase, almost all of it is change in regulations. New requirements for things that have to be added into a vehicle. Now, some folks would back up and say, well, then cars are safer as well. Don't we want that? Well, the problem is it took the choice away from individuals. And individuals that wanted to get a brand new car that was a smaller car, that was new, it's harder and harder for them to do that because the cost continues to go up because everything has that increasing cost. I hear a lot of people in my state talk about the increasing cost of electricity. The cost of electricity right now is going up, even though the cost of fuel is going down. What's the reason for that? The new regulations that are coming down. All these additional regulations from the federal government increase the cost of electricity. So whether you're buying a gallon of milk, whether you're buying a car, whether you're flicking on the light switch at your house, all those costs that have increased, especially over the last several years, and are scheduled to rapidly increase in the next several years as long as the regulations go on, that's the big issue. Let me give you one more. It's harder and harder to get a home loan in a lot of rural areas. A lot of folks that are getting let's say a $50,000, $75,000 house, it's a starter house in a very rural area in America. It's very difficult to get a loan to do that anymore because of the Dodd-Frank regulations. Now, they didn't increase necessarily the cost, but it decreased the options for actually getting a mortgage. So now you've got to get some out-of-state bank to come step into a rural area to do it rather than your local community bank. Okay, that just inconveniences everyone. Everyone wants to deal with a local community bank. Most of them can't anymore because of the Dodd-Frank regulations that are coming down.
And do we want to go to any questions out there in the Meerkat Periscope world? We do. Excellent. Let's see what our first question is. If we could talk about the technology, like how Periscope is being used to communicate and explain complicated issues being debated in the Senate. So how can we use this medium to sort of explain what's going on a few hundred feet away?
Yeah, it's a live conversation. Where we're sitting right now is literally about 120 feet from the door of the Senate. So I'm about to walk out this door, head down the hallway, walk in the back of the Senate chamber, and I'm scheduled to be on the floor actually doing a debate in about 5 minutes. So this is, we're right next to the Senate chamber. So that's just the ongoing part of it, that you can get current up-to-date news. For instance, this morning, most people don't even know about the Permitting Act that went through committee this morning. We just did that, so this is a great opportunity to be able to talk about it live while it's actually going on.
Well, I don't want to prevent you from doing your job for the rest of the day. So from that, I'll just thank everyone who's following us. Make sure to follow at Senator Lankford on Twitter and at AAF on Twitter. And thanks again for everyone who joined.